Tomb Raider 3 stands as one of the most punishing entries in the entire classic series. Released in 1998, it was a game that took everything the franchise had built, including its intricate level design, precision platforming and environmental hazards, and pushed them to a new extreme. For many players, including myself, it was a game that felt overwhelming and sometimes even unfair. But my question is why? What made Tomb Raider 3 so much harder than its predecessors? Well, to understand that, we need to look at how the series evolved up to this point. First Tomb Raider was a game of discovery. Players were introduced to the mechanics of navigating vast, isolated spaces and solving puzzles whilst battling enemies, or animals and supernatural threats. It was difficult at times for sure, but it was methodical. There was a learning curve to start off with, especially with the control setup, but once you understood how Lara moved, the game rewarded patience and careful exploration. Tomb Raider 2 then came along, and it was clear that they had upped the difficulty significantly. And with this, and maybe to their detriment, added in way more enemies and gunfighting, and actually just action overall, including the new ability to be able to drive vehicles and more complex traps. It did, however, do it in a way that was natural and felt proportionate in terms of the skill increase compared to Tomb Raider 1. And then came Tomb Raider 3, where it seemed to me, rather than increase the difficulty relative to Tomb Raider 2, they decided to go even bigger and exploded the difficulty to new heights. The levels were now way more longer, maze-like and huge, and offered you a large amount of exploration compared to Tomb Raider 1 and 2. And other than the new mechanics such as crawling and sprinting and poison, I think the level design was the biggest shift in the game itself. Unlike the first two games, where progression was relatively linear, Tomb Raider 3 had a semi-non-linear structure, which can be seen on levels like Temple Ruins and Lost City of Thnos. I also think a more often overlooked area of difficulty was given in the ability to choose your next location after you completed 4 levels on the previous stage. There is no way of knowing, for example, on a first run through, that on Nevada you're going to lose all of your weapons and medipacks. Therefore, if you happen to take this path last, you would then lose all of the pickups you've got up to this point, making it extremely difficult to head into the Antarctica levels. But let's be serious, the game's difficulty didn't just all come from choosing the right path. All aspects of Tomb Raider had been ramped up to another level when Tomb Raider 3 was released. They really wanted to try and challenge the player in ways they hadn't before, like having several boss fights on level 2 Temple of Ruins. Whose idea was that? And what a sure way to make anyone new to the franchise to turn off the console and never revisit it again. Straight from its opening moments, Tomb Raider 3 seems to set a different tone from its predecessors. The first level, Jungle, didn't seem like an introduction, but more of a test. Actually, drawing similarities from Tomb Raider 2's Great Wall, the game expected you to understand its mechanics straight away, and did actually punish you for the slightest mistake, whether that be the rolling boulders, or the spikes, or going down a slope at the very start of Jungle. If you weren't precise in your movements, you were dead, and it's as simple as that. There are also parts on this level where the game forces you to have a certain amount of replayability. At the start of the jungle to the left, there is the quicksand, and I do often wonder how many people got caught up on this area for hours, thinking this is the right direction to progress through the level. There is monkeys that will steal your medipacks, piranhas that will eat Lara alive if you head into the water, spike traps that move upon pulling levers, and even boulders that will roll out of seemingly unsuspecting bushes to run Lara over. This was the kind of challenge that Tomb Raider 3 was introducing and thrived on, forcing players to learn through failure. But this wasn't just about punishing mistakes, it was about creating a sense of tension and danger. Unlike modern games where checkpoints or respawns make death a minor inconvenience, Tomb Raider 3, I felt, made every death feel like a significant setback. And that was only level 1. The game overall had a tendency, I think, to introduce new mechanics in high pressure situations. For example, crawling was a major addition to Tomb Raider 3, but instead of easing players into it, the game straight away forced you to use the crawling mechanic when there is a boulder right above Lara, immediately putting in the pressure and tension that you are about to die. Oh, and let's not forget about the original Tomb Raider 3, which featured the save crystals. Unlike the PC version, which allowed players to save anywhere, the PlayStation version limited saves through a system of collectible save crystals. This meant that saving at the wrong time, such as before a deadly trap, could result in a situation where restarting the level was the only option. Also, there are times where you've exhausted all of your remaining save crystals and have to tread carefully until you come across the next one. You can imagine the frustration in some players as you have been careful for the next hour or two of your gameplay, only to die and have to reload back to your final save crystal point. By the time the India levels were completed, Tomb Raider 3 made one thing clear: it was not going to make anything easy. But if the opening 4 levels were a warning, what came next, I think, solidified its reputation as one of the toughest games in the series. One of the most striking and obvious differences probably between Tomb Raider 3 and the previous games was how its level design changed. While it is true the first two featured a lot more cavernous open spaces and relatively straightforward pathways, Tomb Raider 3's levels leaned into verticality and complexity. This was immediately obvious in the London section. Levels like Thames Wharf and Aldwych, they weren't confusing because of the enemies or traps, although there was enough of them. What made these levels hard was how confusing they were. London's rooftops and underground tunnels were a complete maze of winding paths, precarious ledges, and hidden switches. Thames Wharf, right at the start, places you high up on a skyline tower, with a clear lack of direction. Unlike the earlier games, where you could usually tell where you needed to go next, Thames Wharf provided little visual guidance. I remember being completely lost on this level as a kid. You would climb all the way down, only to realise you had missed a switch at the top. What a disaster. Just as you think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, you are placed into the level of Aldwych, a level set in an abandoned underground train station. This was a perfect example, in my opinion, of Tomb Raider 3's love for obscure puzzle design. In this level, players had to activate a series of switches, navigate through tight crawl spaces and avoid deadly traps, all while being chased by armed gang members. But that's not what made this level difficult. The real difficulty lied in the challenge of figuring out what to actually do. The level's layout was intentionally misleading, I find. It had fake routes, hidden doors and backtracking that made it feel like you were constantly second guessing yourself and going round in circles. Lud's Gate then aims to build upon this, and instead having the maze above ground, it puts it underwater. Amazing. So, you've completed the London levels and you are finally out of them dreaded mazes. You decide to select the next levels in the South Pacific Islands. If London was about disorientation, these levels were about pure, relentless punishment. In particular, one level comes to mind. Of course, Madubu Gorge. On the surface, it seems like a fairly straightforward, jungle-based platforming section, but this level is home to what I think is often considered one of the most infuriating platform sequences in Tomb Raider history. The kayak section. We all know it, we all remember it. Lara is given a small kayak to navigate the whitewater rapids of the gorge. At first glance, this seems like a fun change of pace, until you realise just how unforgiving the mechanics actually are. I don't think I'm alone in saying this when I say that the kayak is incredibly difficult to control, requiring near perfect precision to avoid slamming into the rocks, getting caught in the currents, or drifting straight into a set of deadly spikes. Compared to the speedboat in Tomb Raider 2, the kayak felt like it had a mind of its own. And to make things worse, the level was filled with almost instant death, waterfalls and traps. A single wrong move could send you straight over the edge, undoing several minutes of progress in an instant. Make sure you save regularly. Or, if you're on the save crystals, make sure you save at a very safe point. And if you are trying to grab additional save crystals, say goodbye to your thumb, which will likely be injured, holding down the controller, attempting to run against the current The South Pacific section, in my opinion, embodied everything that made Tomb Raider 3 so much harder than its predecessors. It didn't just test your skills, it forced you to adapt and avoid the temptation of throwing your controller at the wall. At some point during your Tomb Raider 3 playthrough, you'll be forced to head to the location Nevada. This section was unique, and for most people, they were in for a rude awakening. While the other locations were difficult in terms of platforming and navigation, Nevada was strange because of how unprepared you could end up. You see, in the other locations, Lara retained most of her weapons and supplies. Nevada, however, pulled one of the cruelest tricks in the game, where, at the beginning of High Security Compound, you're entirely stripped of all of your weapons, and all but one small medipack. This required the player to think differently, and that for a significant portion of the level, they were forced to rely entirely on stealth and platforming. Suddenly, every enemy encounter became a terrifying challenge, as players had to carefully time their movements to avoid detection. Unlike previous games, where you could often brute force your way through tough sections with enough firepower, High Security Compound was different and forced you to survive with nothing. And let's not forget about the epic shootout that you do eventually have once you recover your weapons. If you've ever tried this on New Game Plus, you'll understand just how challenging this section is. By the time players made it through Nevada, they weren't just dealing with difficulty, platforming, or confusing layouts. They were dealing with almost pure survival. By now, it should be clear that Tomb Raider 3 wasn't just a difficult game. It was a ruthless test of endurance, with London disorientating players with its labyrinth-level design. The South Pacific demanded near-perfect platforming and surviving frustrating times when controlling the kayak. Finally, Nevada stripped players of their weapons, forcing them into an almost survival mode. But for all the challenges these regions presented, there was still one final challenge yet to come. At first glance, Antarctica to me should have been a welcoming change. Compared to the dense jungles, the towering rooftops and scorching desert of Nevada, an icy open landscape might have seemed less intimidating. But then I remembered, this was Tomb Raider 3. There was no such thing as an easy level. Combining all of the elements from the previous levels, the Antarctica area added something new: horror. For the first time in the series, Lara could actually take damage simply by being in the environment for too long. Falling into freezing water meant almost instant death. One of the most infamous levels here was RX Tech Mines. This level perfectly embodied Tomb Raider 3's philosophy of punishing mistakes. It featured underwater tunnels, where players had to manage their oxygen and the new hypothermia mechanic. Sprawling industrial complexes filled with deadly crushers, and of course hitting the signposts when controlling the minecart. These are all elements which again force you into replayability of the level, as there is really no way that you would know you were going in the wrong direction on the minecart without first dying several times. And if that wasn't enough, the enemies in Antarctica were also some of the toughest enemies in the game. Unlike the human enemies of previous levels, these foes were terrifying. Mutated creatures through genetic experiments were incredibly fast, powerful and relentless. By the time the players escaped the freezing hellscape of Antarctica, they'd already endured some of the most punishing challenges in the game. But the worst was yet to come. If there's one level that defines Tomb Raider 3's difficulty, it is of course the lost city of Thnos. This level is legendary for its sheer complexity, brutal traps and punishing platforming. Even after 100 playthroughs of this game, this level still gives me nightmares. It was designed to break players. Unlike previous levels, which at least provided a little bit of sense of direction, Thnos was a sprawling maze of interconnected chambers, each filled with puzzles that required near-perfect execution. Whether it be an underwater section with rotating traps, a room with collapsing rocks, or a challenge that required you to think on your feet in the midst of fire to grab onto an invisible ledge. Each room presented a new challenge which the player had not seen before and had to adapt immediately to overcome. And let's not forget about the almost unlimited supply of dragonflies that are constantly on your tail trying to kill Lara. This is also, in my opinion, one of the most rewarding levels to complete throughout the entire Tomb Raider franchise. By the time you reach the end of Tomb Raider 3, there isn't just a sense of relief, there is a sense of exhaustion. This was not a game that handed out victories easily. Every level demanded patience, precision and problem solving, and every mistake was punished. Every ounce of progress had to be earned. And, for those of us who appreciate a tough but fair challenge, Tomb Raider 3 delivered in a way few other games ever could. Tomb Raider 3 rewarded mastery. You had to learn its mechanics, precision and strategic resource management. You had to be aware of the environment around you and use everything in your power to survive. The game's non-linear level design, while frustrating for some, also made the experience feel a bit more open-minded. People themselves had to figure out things what were going on, which made progression a lot more rewarding. Unlike the first two games, which had a more straightforward flow, Tomb Raider 3 encouraged players to take their time, explore every corner, and think outside the box. And in my opinion, at the end of the day, whether you loved or hated Tomb Raider 3's difficulty, one thing is certain, it's a game that demanded respect. It wasn't a game that any casual could pick up and just breeze through. It forced players to learn its mechanics, to think carefully about every move, and to earn their progress. And is why I think one of the most rewarding games in the series. So, do you think Tomb Raider 3 was too difficult, or was it the ultimate test of skill? In my opinion, that depends on who you ask. Some players still love its challenge, returning to it again and again, as I do, to prove that they can conquer it. Others, I feel, see it as an experience best left in the past, too frustrating, too punishing, and too needlessly complicated. One thing is for sure, Tomb Raider 3 is one of the hardest games in the entire franchise, and for those who did make it to the end, the sense of victory was unlike anything else. Because finishing Tomb Raider 3 wasn't just about completing a game, it was about mastering it.